Welcome back. We are very lucky right now to have a panel of experts coming to us from around the world to talk about rare diseases in their parts of the globe. So if you could pull up the slide of our speakers. We have with us Samuel Wiafe, who comes to us from Ghana. He's a clinical psychologist at the Ga East Municipal Hospital, and he's founder and executive director of the Rare Disease Ghana Initiative. Gareth Banum comes to us from Australia, where he is a clinical professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of Western Australia in Perth. Ritu Jain comes to us from Singapore, where she is president of the Dystrophic Epidermolysis Bullosa Research Association, known as DEBRA, that's in Singapore. Durhan Wong Rieger comes to us from Toronto. She is president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders and chair of Rare Disease International. And she's also played an instrumental role in the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Disease Organizations. And Daria Julkowska comes to us from Paris. She is assistant director of the Thematic Institute of Genetics at INSERM, the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research. She is also a coordinator for the European Joint Program on Rare Diseases and Scientific Secretariat Coordinator for the International Rare Diseases Research Consortium. So to all five of you, welcome. Thank you very much for joining today. We especially want to thank all of you for coming to us from various time zones around the world. Ritu and Gareth, you are at 11 o'clock p.m. your time in Singapore and Australia. Samuel is in the late afternoon in Ghana, and Daria is in Europe, and Durhan Wong Rieger is the only one on my time zone in the Eastern U.S. time zone. So this is intended to give a broad overview of rare diseases efforts around the world, how things are different in different parts of the world. How, our last speaker was from the U.S. She was talking about kind of the U.S. model for that. But how are rare diseases being tackled, research supported in the EU? How are they being supported in Asia? How are they being supported in Africa? And so we want to give a sense of those. We're going to hear from all five speakers. We're going to start with Daria Julkowska. Daria and Ritu Jain. We'll hear from Daria, then Ritu Jain, then Gareth, then Samuel, and then Durhan. The first two speakers will have short PowerPoints. We're going to hear from each speaker from 7 or 8 or 9 minutes, talking a little bit about what's going on in their part of the world, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So plan out your questions. We will hear from the five of them over the next 45 or so minutes, but then we'll have a good time for 45 minutes of Q&A. I have some questions, but I want to turn most of this over to our fellows and viewers. So thank you all for joining in. Dr. Julkowska, I'll turn it over to you right now. And she's going to talk about how rare diseases are approached and researched in the EU, including how that differs from the US, where Dr. Ann Pariser was just talking. Daria, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it will work. You should be able to see my... Do you see the slides in the full screen mode? I can't see anything or hear anything, so I hope that yes. Okay, so I'm going to present you very briefly the approach to rare diseases in Europe. And to start with, I thought that it would be interesting to have a comparison with what is happening now, so with the COVID-19 pandemic. So when you look at the fact that we are about 8 billion people in the world, in terms of patients, the rare diseases patients represent today in the world around 300 million, while at least at the moment I was writing this slide, there were about 176 million of patients with COVID. We are talking here about in comparison of one disease to almost 7,000 rare diseases. In terms of time to diagnosis, today with the COVID, we can get an answer sometimes within 15 minutes after taking a test. But for the rare diseases patients, it takes about 5 years to get the diagnosis. However, the access to care is scattered and hampered for both. In terms of treatment, as you have seen, for the COVID, it is difficult and progressive. However, for rare diseases, there are about 95% that do not have any treatment. And of course, the impact on health is very high. And if we think about the challenges for rare diseases, and also with the current pandemic, they are actually quite similar. So we have to manage the uncertainty and the need to adoption of the healthcare systems, the use, for example, of the telehealth, the management and the reuse of patient data, how to link between the research and the healthcare. It means also how to train the qualified personnel, as well as how to make sure that patient is really at the center. So in terms of Europe, of course, and if you think about rare diseases and taking into account that there are only few patients in the world with the same rare disease, the collaboration is key. And obviously, this is also the approach that we are taking in Europe and in the European Union. So what you need to know is that it's more than 2 decades that actually the European Union and Europe is investing in rare diseases, but it also is tackling it from different perspectives. So this has been translated into different types of recommendations. So these were the ones that were issued actually in the 2017, and as you can see, the idea here is really to work together, to work globally, so to support the integration and the networking among the European researchers, as well as patients and healthcare organizations, to make sure that the regulatory requirements are adapted, to support the technology, to develop legally and ethically robust agreements to collect the data, as well as to collaborate globally. And as you can see, between 2006 and 2020, the European Commission, not the Europe as a whole, but the European Commission, invested about 1.8 billion euros in research on rare diseases. And when we compare this with the investment, for example, in the current investment in COVID, as you can see, since 1 year and a half, there is already over 1 billion euros that was invested in the COVID. So we can say that in Europe, the rare disease research and rare diseases are important, but they are not yet, I would say, recognized at the scale as we would like to. However, it is important to note that in Europe, in 2009, there was a very important recommendation that was issued and a regulation that was issued by the European Commission and European Union, and that allowed on the creation and that encouraged the creation of the national plans on rare diseases. And so this was really very important because it meant that every country in Europe was encouraged to establish and to implement a dedicated national plan or strategy for rare diseases. This included a specific coding, for example, of rare diseases. So like that, you can identify the patients with a rare disease. It also summarized the priorities for basic clinical and translational research and the fact that there is the importance of the collaboration. There was also a creation and identification of the appropriate center of expertise. So you have probably have heard also from Anne Pariser that in the United States, we have, for example, rare diseases clinical research networks. In Europe, in every country, the idea was really to identify the expertise center that are specialized in rare diseases. Finally, it also encouraged the strong collaboration with patients and patient representatives, and of course, to ensure the sustainability of all of that through the years. This also resulted in 2017 of creation of what we call the European reference networks. So what actually happened is that we moved from a national scale to a European scale in terms of the healthcare. And this is the basis for the creation of the European reference networks. So the idea was to connect those specialized expertise centers in every country to create a dedicated network. So we have 24 European reference networks that are grouped by the groups of rare diseases. And in a way that it is the expertise that travels to the patients and not the patient who has to travel to the experts. So this is the whole idea behind to have the expertise, the healthcare that is being shared among the European countries. As you can imagine, this is not This is quite a challenge because, of course, we have many European countries that speak also different languages, but it means also that we can create this community that can help and share the expertise, but also to learn from each other at the European level. So in a way, if we want to summarize it, we have different elements that resume the rare disease research landscape in Europe. As I mentioned, we have the healthcare through the European reference networks. We also have the patients' needs that are expressed by different patient organizations. And in Europe, we have EuroOrdis, which is the biggest patient organization that brings together more than 900 patient organizations from 73 countries. At the European level, together, the member states, but also the European Commission, established a dedicated funding mechanism to finance research on rare diseases. We also created a dedicated infrastructures that are either specific to rare diseases, like, for example, the Orphanet, which is the biggest encyclopedia that brings together different information about rare diseases, that allows encoding of rare diseases, but also other infrastructures that are more oriented to the medical research, but they can support rare disease research. And finally, the strategy, and you are going to hear more later on in the next session about the International Rare Disease Research Consortium. So what was missing is how we could bring all this together and in a way make this link between the national strategies, the European strategies, and international one. And this is why we created the European Joint Program on Rare Diseases that I'm currently coordinating, for which the main objective was really to create the rare diseases research ecosystem with all the instruments that are necessary to support and accelerate research, of course, for the benefit of patients. So today, this consortium brings together different types of stakeholders. So under one umbrella, you will have funders, patient organizations, hospitals, universities, infrastructures working together for the same objective. So it translates into more than 35 countries that participate together and that are implementing a specific action. So we, at the same time, we focus on research funding or funding of research for rare diseases. We are also building so-called the virtual platform that allows to bring different type of data resources that can be shared and that can accelerate rare disease research. We also do a training activities and capacity building, especially also oriented towards patients, as well as the acceleration of the research results and clinical studies. All that, of course, is coordinated under one single umbrella. So this is, in summary, what we have. What we can say is that today, through the creation of the European Joint Program, that of course I cannot say it doesn't, of course, respond to every single problem of rare diseases, but at least in terms of the rare diseases research, we can say that we have a single entry point that allows on finding the solutions for different types of stakeholders: researchers, clinicians, patients, policymakers, as well as international partners. And I'm going to stop here and give the floor to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll go to Ritu Jain in just 1 second. But Daria, if we could get Daria back here briefly. One very simple question. You were showing the European Joint Program on Rare Disorders, and it had European countries as far as to Turkey. It also included Canada. I'm just curious, why is Canada involved, and is Canada also involved with North American or U.S. efforts?
So the Canada, I think that the collaboration is because we have also quite a lot of different collaborations with Canada and Europe. We also actually apply the same definition of rare diseases, which is 5 in 10,000. So I think it's also a heritage of the collaboration. And of course, we hope that through the collaboration that we are also now developing within the International Rare Diseases Research Consortium, that for the next phase of this program, we will be able to involve more partners. But it doesn't mean that we do not collaborate. It is just that they are not necessarily full partners or beneficiaries of this specific program. But the collaboration with Canada actually stems from a longer-term collaboration that started already in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. So it's been several years actually that we are working, especially on the funding activities with Canada.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So let's our viewers and fellows, if you want to ask a question of any one of the speakers as they're going, I'll be able to field one or two questions in between each speakers. We don't have to wait for all of the questions for the end. But let's now turn to Ritu Jain. So Dr. Jokowska, thank you very much. Let's turn to Ritu Jain, who is coming to us from very late from Singapore. She's going to discuss the challenges of trying to maintain a focus on rare diseases in a region that has such, kind of vast political, cultural, and language differences. And so I'll turn it over to Ritu, and she will present for a bit. If you have a question, toss it to us. We'll work a question or two in between her and our next speaker, and then we'll have time for more questions afterwards. So Ritu, thank you for coming to us so late, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Are you able to see my screen? Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you, and I see the screen, yes.
Thank you. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm going to continue where Daria left off. While Daria has illustrated that there is so much work to be done, yet I see what she's presented as a very optimistic outlook and picture. In contrast, I'm presenting to you a rather different one from the Global South, from Asia Pacific. Let's start with giving you a bit of a glimpse into the physical diversity and scope of Asia Pacific, which contains about 4.3 billion, which has a population of 4.3 billion approximately, which is roughly 60% of the global total population. And this diversity, you can see, is mirrored also in the physical diversity of different countries and populations scattered across a very vast and the world's largest archipelago here in the Malay archipelago. These realities enhance and exacerbate the challenges of living with rare diseases and managing rare diseases in the region, as I'm going to illustrate. In Asia Pacific, some estimates have put the burden of rare diseases as 258 million, essentially 6% of the population affected by rare, which also illustrates the very irony of rare. What does rare mean? While actually there is no objective medical definition of rare, and while they afflict just few, each condition afflicts few people relatively. In combination, the prevalence of rare diseases is really high. And you can see by, again, approximate figures, the burden of rare diseases by some of the countries, 13 countries in APAC that I've chosen to put on the screen. An approximate, yes, but still collectively a very big burden. Let me tell you a little bit about how I perceive of some of the challenges of living with rare diseases and managing rare diseases in the Asia Pacific. And these are pretty unique to the region and perhaps shared in the Global South. But in addition to the physical diversity, the huge region, geographic spread of these countries with rare disease populations, in Asia Pacific, what's really unique is also a huge diversity of cultures, religion, language, healthcare systems, lack of socioeconomic development, access to healthcare. So I'll share with you a little bit of the data that I've pulled together from reports that were generated by The Economist in 2020, as well as by the World Economic Forum and KPMG in 2021. Some of the features identified in the Asia Pacific and specific to this are not really specific, but very endemic to Asia Pacific, is lack of priority accorded to rare diseases. In most parts of Asia Pacific, there is a lack of official definition of what exactly is a rare disease. Most definitions are by prevalence, and yet there is no agreement. There is limited data and almost no data and studies around rare diseases. And APEC is said to be publishing 3 times less studies around rare diseases compared to Europe. There is a very limited capacity and capability for diagnostics as well as for care, with limited screening, with a huge population of with huge populations having no access to newborn screening, diagnostics at diagnostic services, and with healthcare physicians and experts almost very, very scarce. The capacity and training of healthcare professionals in the region is extremely limited, and perhaps centered in the more developed countries like Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, some areas of China, parts of India, but many countries in the region still suffer from lack of trained healthcare professionals who can diagnose and treat rare conditions. In countries where you do have diagnosis or access to healthcare, access to professionals, there may be limited accessibility to treatment. So where treatment is possible, often, in most cases, it is unaffordable. And patients who could even get access to these healthcare professionals will not be able to afford this care. So the other aspect that's rather unique to rare diseases in Asia Pacific is the lack of affordability. Traditionally, the sources of funding for rare diseases is either taxes or social insurance and social and private insurance. However, in the Asia Pacific, there is a very limited tax base, with the tax to GDP ratio in the majority of the region being less than 15%, which makes the tax base unsustainable to fund healthcare programs, especially rare disease programs. A shrinking workforce due to aging populations, as well as the widespread informal workforces that are not captured by the tax systems at more than 50% of this informal workforce, further exacerbates the lack of funding at the macro systems of financing. In addition, the social health insurance systems are really hobbled by lack of participation, as well as the widespread informal workforces. And private insurance and external aid, which is the third pillar of financing pathways, are similarly affected in the Asia Pacific, because private insurance is virtually inaccessible, with only high-income households affording private insurance, where the penetration is estimated to be less than 5% compared to the global numbers. Rare diseases also, rare disease networks often rely on select donors to support patients, but in the Asia Pacific, this is very, very rare and sparse. So collectively, the burden of these, the lack of financing pathways impacts rare diseases by patients incurring huge out-of-pocket expenses, which exceeds 3 times of their total income often. And public reimbursement plans for orphan diseases are almost inaccessible and unavailable in the Asia Pacific. So while this paints a rather bleak picture, we do have some shoots of hope, some beginnings, and some strengthenings of endeavors that have been going on for decades in parts of Asia Pacific. For example, Australia has a national strategic action plan for rare diseases, and I'm sure Gareth will detail a little more about that. Japan also has a rare disease plan. It's one of the 9 priority areas since 2015. South Korea has a Rare Disease Management Act since 2015, and Taiwan was really the pioneer on rare diseases around Asia Pacific, with it having the world's 5th Orphan Drug Act since the 2000s. China too, while it doesn't have any official legislation around rare diseases, but has an expert committee of rare disease treatment and support since 2016, which is looking at ways to make affordable healthcare for rare diseases possible in the near future. So, having given you an example of the region, let me share a quick glimpse of or let me share a case study with you that's closer to home. But before I do that, Jeff, could I have an idea on how I'm doing for time, please?
Yeah, you're doing fine. So it looks like you have a couple more slides. So
All
a few
right.
more minutes is fine.
Thank you. So DEBRA Singapore is an organization that I have been working with for the past 5 years, and my insights with this organization for people with a very rare genetic disorder called epidermolysis bullosa has given me insights into rare diseases at the grassroots level more than at the policy level, really. There's a documentary here which illustrates what I'm going to share with you. It's on YouTube in the region and on Netflix, called Butterfly Children. It it highlights really some of the stark challenges of living with rare diseases at various levels, such as diagnosis. So let me share with you that for people living with epidermolysis bullosa, often diagnosis is the first challenge at birth. And while for most rare diseases, diagnosis is actually the first rung on the ladder of on the pathway to care, for people living with epidermolysis bullosa or EB, diagnosis actually is the first rung to up on on a ladder with broken rungs, as this image illustrates. This actually is really the picture depicts the challenges of most patients living with rare disorders in the Asia Pacific. So once you get diagnosed in a country, let's say in India or Pakistan, that does not make any difference to a person's life, because treatment, even if it's available, first of all, there is no understanding or expertise in epidermolysis bullosa in most countries. And where amongst the few dermatologists there is some awareness and knowledge, there is no, their patients are unable to afford the care, because neither is care and healthcare available or affordable, but the devices and dressings that are required by patients every single day of their lives are unaffordable and beyond the reach of most people. Where these devices and drugs are available, affordable, they may not be available. In countries like Pakistan, where we've been lobbying for years to get these dressings made available, it has been a losing battle for the past 4 years. Research around epidermolysis bullosa is mostly, if not all, centered in the US and Europe, but patient organizations like DEBRA do collaborate with the networks outside of Asia Pacific and try to facilitate research as well as clinical trials, as we have done successfully in Singapore. Social support for caregivers and patients living with rare diseases, and especially with EB, is non-existent in most of these countries. Parents often quit their jobs to become full-time caregivers. Poverty levels are significantly exacerbated, and in some cases, as I have seen, parents often abandon their children to orphanages. Data around rare diseases is, I have almost no knowledge of data around rare diseases prevalence in Asia Pacific. And all these challenges are further exacerbated by the cultural stigma around rare diseases, and also certain other cultural factors like intermarriage in some of the cultures in Asia Pacific, consanguinity or intermarriage, which means there are multiple children in the same family, multiple members with the same disease, which collectively pose an insurmountable burden on the family. Of course, there's then the wider stigma and discrimination that just often is the last straw for many of these patients. So where do you come in? Well, 3 short words: make some noise. Make some noise, highlight the oversight, the exclusion, the lack of equity, the lack of inclusion for people living with rare disorders all over the world, particularly in the Asia Pacific, and put pressure on governments, on healthcare systems, on policymakers to allow some respect, dignity, inclusion, and equity for people with rare disorders. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have, let's take one question right now before we move on to Gareth Banum, who will be our next speaker. This question comes from one of our fellows, Aaron Prater. do you believe that the collectivist nature of cultures in Asia presents a barrier to tackling the issue of rare diseases, which are often very niche and individualized by nature?
I actually think that the collectivist nature is a factor that supports people living with rare disorders, where communities, families come together. In fact, if this is my understanding of a collectivist culture, then I find that the rare disease networks is perhaps the only saving grace for people living with rare disorders in Asia Pacific, but I can say mostly for the globe, for the world.
Okay. And just one quick question for me. You mentioned that Taiwan had the as one of the wins, the 5th Orphan Drug Act. I'm just curious, how does that actually work? I mean, a relatively small country like Taiwan, are there enough incentives to get pharmaceutical companies to participate in rare diseases research or drug development compared to doing so with support from like the U.S. Orphan Drug Act or the equivalent in Europe?
Thanks, Chris. I think Taiwan has had a very long history of sustained lobbying and advocacy for rare diseases. It's been championed by patients, clinicians, researchers coming together to lobby with the governments. And this sustained endeavor has led to to the outcome of the Orphan Drug Act. Having lived in Taiwan, I can also say that it's a society that's very, very civic-minded, very caring, and very equitable. They really do look at people, citizens, as equitable members of society. And I believe Taiwan has just been a leader rather than looking looking beyond its borders to mimic for success.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So great talk. We will get more from you in the Q&A session. And now let's go to Gareth Banum, who is from the University of Western Australia, also coming to us nearly at midnight his time. So thank you very much for joining in today. He's going to talk about trust and transformation, the issue of trust, particularly as it relates to indigenous populations, but also how rare diseases could be a way to help build and rebuild the healthcare system. So Dr. Banum, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good evening, good morning to all wherever you are. My name's Gareth Bannon. I'm a genetics doctor in Western Australia, and really in Australia, where I would very much say I think we're still awakening to rare diseases. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. We really have a new starting point, thanks to our fantastic colleagues in Europe, in North America, and certainly in other regions in our shared time zone and its neighbours. I think one of the really exciting aspects of more recent developments in Australia is our National Strategic Action Plan for Rare Diseases, which was launched last year. I think it was particularly exciting that it was in fact the government that commissioned the peak advocacy group for rare diseases, Rare Voices Australia, to create that strategic action plan, to engage the stakeholders and to deliver that, and now is very actively involved in the implementation of that plan. There are 3 pillars under that plan: awareness and education, care and support, and research and data. And also to tie to the introduction, within that there are also priority populations. And those priority populations are those people living in remote and regional areas who have extra needs by virtue of their geographic location and their relative inaccess, often to medical services and to research, and to culturally and linguistically diverse populations, including Indigenous populations. So whatever we develop is developed in a culturally safe and responsive manner. There have been a number of recent announcements around rare disease research initiatives at a national level in Australia, including the recent launch of the Undiagnosed Diseases Network Australia, so a national network of diagnostic expertise to address the challenge of being undiagnosed. I want to sort of drill down now to talk about my own jurisdiction. That's Western Australia, and if you remember Ritu's lovely slide of APAC, and you at the bottom of the slide there was Australia, this rather large continent, and our state, Western Australia, is 1/3 of the size of the total landmass of Australia. To give you a context of the sort of magnitude of size we're talking about, because it is geographically the world's largest public health jurisdiction. It's about 3.5 times the size of Texas, or in fact, it's approximately the same size as the total landmass of the United States of America. That provides many challenges and also opportunities that really range from the diversity of care in metropolitan regions through to remote and regional and very remote regions where it can be several hours flight even within your same state, often potentially followed by train, bus, car trips, walking. So in fact, for some people from our very remote communities, it might take them 30 hours to get to a metropolitan centre. Because of that, our government has always had a very large interest in better delivering remote and regional care and care to Indigenous populations. We share the same time zone as approximately 30 to 40% of the world's population. And as a state in 2015, we're very fortunate that our government launched the first rare diseases strategic framework in the Southern Hemisphere. More recently in the fields of precision health, and really that's about how do we bring care to the most and to the most at need. We've seen increasing focus through the Ministerial Council for Precision Health, which brings together a number of stakeholders to look at systemic and sustainable implementations of new technologies and new data and new approaches in the health system to address enormous challenges such as the rare disease challenge. I also reflect that many of the initiatives that we have implemented and then scaled statewide have really been driven and implemented and started by serving the needs of Aboriginal families and children, and in particular Aboriginal families and children in very remote areas, because if you like, they are at the greatest need by the virtue of a triple whammy. That triple whammy is being very remote, having a rare disease, and also the Indigenous health, Indigenous status. And so recurrently we've seen the latest technologies being implemented together with Aboriginal families and communities first, technologies including whole genome sequencing, artificial intelligence and text mining, 3D facial analysis, and our universal Indigenous medical translator initiative, Life Languages. Each of these have started really working together with Aboriginal families, youth, elders, community to address needs, and then secondarily those solutions have been extended, if you like, into metropolitan areas or to non-Indigenous peoples. So really for the benefit of all of us. Equally, as I reflected, we increasingly see that it, in fact, is the combination of the world's oldest living continuous culture, that is Aboriginal culture in Australia, which has existed for at least 60,000 years, combining with the latest new technologies and approaches to really transform our health care. The journey is very much one of trust. Things must proceed at the speed of trust. That is to say, they must that these things, there is an urgent need, but coupled with that urgent need is the need for calm, considered action that is really driven by the needs of the community. Needs of the community first, and in a time, manner, and way that best serves their need. Equally, in terms of transformation, we see rare disease, that there is really clarity from the extremity of rare diseases. We're talking about typically severe, devastating, often lifelong illnesses, which can be associated with mental health burden, intellectual or physical disability, and really significant impact across the whole life journey, be it in health, be it in the social sector, be it the education, be it in the education centre. But that severity it also meets with opportunity. Necessity very much is the mother of invention, and we see a huge range of transformative technologies and approaches, new medicines, transformative research coming from the rare disease domain, which then commonly translates to improved care for people with more common conditions. I think I'm also struck both locally in Australia, but also more globally by the enormous community advocacy and leadership. It truly is a domain where the community's voice is unified, active, and transforms into a systemic and scalable action. I think we only need to reflect on who's in the panel today. We have Ritu Jain from Aparto. We have Dane Wangwada from Rare Disease International, and Samuel Wiafi from Rare Disease Ghana Initiative. All incredible community leaders, and then working together with stakeholders such as the irrepressible Daria Jakolska from the EJPRD. And then as we move forward, I think the largest emerging focus for both clinical care and research is building, establishing, and globally linking centres of expertise for rare diseases. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we, as I said, send your questions on in. I see we had a question that came in for Ritu. I didn't notice it at the time, but I'll catch up on that when we go to the full Q&A for everybody. But now let's go to Samuel. If we could get him up on screen. So Samuel Wiafe is with Ghana Rare Disease Ghana Rare Disease Initiative. He's going to discuss some of the challenges of getting people to focus on rare diseases while also dealing with the tremendous burden of infectious diseases. And Samuel, welcome. Thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning, depending on your time zone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share my perspective on the rare disease, and also how we are working and what is changing in our part of the world. I would go ahead by telling you a story about what happened in 2017. My background is clinical psychology, and I had opportunity to meet a family and with an unknown syndrome, and having to looking at how the health system was set up. It was very, very challenging to support this family, and so that drew me into the rare disease space to advocate for the family, and it's now brought us where we are. Previous speakers have already talked about some of the challenges that with the rare disease community regarding the lack of definition for rare diseases, lack of access to diagnosis, lack of access to treatment, and basically the lack of support group and lack of research for most rare diseases. And these challenges are not different from what we witness here. However, these problems and challenges are worsened because we also have our unique challenges. One of those unique challenges is the fact that our healthcare system traditionally has been set up to deal with the infectious diseases largely. And so many of the time we've been focused on dealing with cholera, diabetes, tuberculosis, HIV, malaria, and many infectious diseases. And for the non-communicable diseases, they have been an area which has been largely neglected. And it has been an area that a lot of people are campaigning and calling on the attention of the government to pay attention. We can talk about very common non-communicable diseases like cancers, breast cancers, and diabetes, and hypertension, stroke, nephrology diseases, kidney diseases, chronic kidney diseases, and all of these areas have not got the needed attention. And so to bring out the issue of rare diseases to decision makers and policy makers is really a huge challenge. Being able to get the decision makers to pay attention to rare diseases is one of the most challenging situations in our part of the world, and it's largely because we also we have limited funding to health, and so governments usually have no option than to prioritize. And in the course of prioritization, we stand a chance of neglecting certain diseases, and which usually are the rare diseases. And so as such, we begin to live and do our things like they do not exist. And we do not have any efforts in terms of medical training for the training of medical professionals to even focus on rare diseases. We treat rare diseases as familiar or unfamiliar, like they do not exist in our part of the world. And I've had so many confrontation and questions when I have to talk about rare diseases. And the next many a times, the questions are you sure these are not diseases that affect people in the West? Do you think we really see these diseases? Do they exist? And it becomes a shock when you have to show evidence in terms of showing an actual patient with the disease to somebody. And that is when it's really hits the person to come to terms and accept that rare diseases do really actually exist in our part of the world. And so there's little investment, little attention, and until recently, until we came into advocacy and leading the space and championing the cause of rare diseases, there was no government document that had mentioned rare diseases or had recognized rare diseases until March 2019, when the FDA, through our engagement with them, published a guideline for registration of orphan drugs. And in that document, they did state, and that's the first time they mentioned rare diseases and defined rare diseases. And so that was for us an opening, because we realized that whatever we were doing was actually making some efforts, as we saw that some government agencies had started listening and had started recognizing rare diseases. Recently, what has also happened is the fact that through engagement, and recently in the government published a new national health policy. And in that policy, we saw that the government had, though had not verbally or directly mentioned rare diseases, had made room to make strong statements regarding inclusion and regarding equity. And these are two major issues that we've been engaging the government on to consider in making sure that rare diseases are factored in our national plan. And for us, it's an opening, and we know that it's an area we can continue to engage with the government. Another area that was largely had not been talked about, but recently has got a lot of interest, is in the area of newborn screening. And the Sickle Cell Foundation had earlier on talked about newborn screening and had even initiated a couple of projects to screen babies for inherited condition, but they've focused largely on sickle cell disease. And recently, we've also picked it up again, and we have been holding series of engagement around newborn screening, and there's a private lab that is willing to commercialize newborn screening in our part of the world and be able to ensure that newborn screening cuts across in a better way. We still having engagement with the government with options regarding being able to make a law or direct commitment to newborn screening in Ghana. One of the other challenges I saw in our part of the world was in the area of stigma. Because of the way we live, we seem to spiritualize everything that we do not know and anything that we do not understand. Ghana's health system is very pluralistic. When I say pluralistic, it means that we are dealing not only with the mainstream healthcare system, which government is funding, but we're also dealing with alternative modes of care, including prayer camps and herbal treatments being part of the care that people go for in terms of healthcare. And so these additions of the care makes the journey even more longer for most rare diseases. And usually before a patient even gets to see a doctor who may have an idea, the patient would have run through other complex systems, missing a herbalist or a malam or a prophet who might have told them their disease or their condition is due to spiritual attacks and curses on the family, and they would spend a lot of the time and a lot of their resources in these places and with these alternative treatments before they get to the healthcare. So it's very different compared to other jurisdictions and other areas where the healthcare is very linear and people just go straight to the hospital. But here, many people would consult other models of care before they even come to the hospital, which makes it even longer to get the care. Aside the fact that the getting diagnosis is very difficult, there are lack of labs. The labs are not there, and the few labs that are here do not run complex testing such as the genetic test, the whole genome sequencing, and the exome sequencing. They are not available. There are not much complicated investigation can be done. If even a clinician suspects, they cannot go further to confirm, and they leave the patient. They abandon the patient along the way because they have other patients to take care of, and the patient-doctor ratio is so huge. And so if you have a rare disease and we don't have much information for you, we'll just move to the next patient, and many a time the patients are left unattended to patients with rare diseases. And so these are few of the major unique challenges we face. There are so many of them. Poverty, I said the stigma is very high in our setting, and it's for us here, the stigma does not only affect the patient, it goes to a broader extent, affecting the bigger family, because we are very interdependent and collective, and so we derive identity. So many a times, because there's not much information in terms of what one can know or do with rare diseases, or not much information available to the family, many people who do not understand rare diseases tend to spiritualize it and begin to blame the family who are affected. And because we cannot test and provide the information that the family needs to know that, oh, this condition may be a genetic disease or maybe a rare disease, and we may not have all the information available to the family. So the family may lose a child and then have another child with a similar condition and have another child. And in that case, people may begin to blame that family for having a bad blood or something, and it goes way beyond to that extent to affect even the bigger family who may be affected with a rare disease. So I will end here, and I wish if you have any question, I could answer them. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you very much. I have a question for you, but I guess I'd rather hear our fifth speaker, and then we'll have a good 25 or so minutes for Q&A. We have questions from the fellows coming in. But let's now turn to Durhan Wong Rieger, who's going to talk about her work in Canada and PARDO, but also Rare Diseases International, and how these desperate groups from around the world come together to try to share resources. She's coming to us from Toronto, and I'll turn it over to you now. Can't hear you. Unmute.
Thank you very much, and many, many thanks for the invitation to participate. I feel a little bit superfluous at this point, having heard all of the other speakers, but really do want to also bring some highlights from Canada. I think, as Chris indicated, I have a multiple roles within rare diseases. Personally, I have two children, both born with rare diseases, and both of them actually adopted from the Asia Pacific origin. So have a real strong affinity, obviously, to the Asia Pacific area, and do sit currently as president of the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Diseases Organization. So really happy to build on all the things that Ritu talked about. I also do serve as chair of Rare Diseases International, which, as others have indicated, is our international alliance of patients and multi-stakeholder organizations across the globe. And we'll briefly mention some of the global activities that we're doing, especially with regard to some of the other global institutions like the WHO and the United Nations. I also, though and also do serve as the patient advisor to the APEC Rare Disease Framework. So I've been really pleased over the past number of years to be able to work more closely with the kinds of initiatives that are taking place in the various countries, some in Latin America like Chile and in Peru, but also obviously in Latin America, in Asia Pacific, and most recently the initiatives are in China, and hopefully some more that's taking place this year in China. So just to come back, though, to Canada, and I do want to speak a little bit about it. You know, Canada, I think it was interesting. Somebody, the question around, Chris asked Daria, why is Europe or Canada in the EJP, in the European Joint Program? And of course, there is a lot of affinity between the things that we do here in Canada and with the EU. And we have been partners, not just in the EJP, but on many projects. And in part because even though we sit just north of the US, in terms of the healthcare system, even in terms of culture, and I would say political outlook, we are probably much more aligned to Europe. And so there's a great deal that we do with Europe, and there's a great deal that we do in collaboration in many areas in terms of not just health, but also in terms of social, economic, etc. So it's been a real benefit to Canada to be a part of it, because we've been able to leverage our contributions to a much greater extent, but also to take advantage of the amazing programs that have taken place there. But what I want to come to is something that I think is really exciting, and is probably a first in the world, as far as I can tell, and that is Canada is hopefully on the brink of launching our national rare disease drug strategy. This was first introduced in 2019 by commitment of the federal government to invest $1 billion to setting up a rare disease drug program. This would be to try to bring in and to make available on a timely basis drugs for rare diseases for a patient population that in many respects has not actually received the same kinds of care and attention, I think, as other communities. I mean, to be very honest, we know that the driver in terms of bringing forth this rare disease strategy, in addition to the huge amount of advocacy that we've done as a patient community, is also the fact that there are so many new drugs that are coming forth for rare diseases. Many of these are highly innovative drugs, including cellular and gene therapies, which are going to have a tremendous impact and benefit for patients, but are also coming in at very high cost. And I think the government certainly recognizing the fact that if we're going to make these drugs available, we're going to need to make sure that they're going to be given to the right people, provided with the right kind of monitoring, and also going to have to be done in a way that's going to be sustainable within a healthcare budget, not different from anybody else. But the fact that this is a program that will be specifically to look at, especially these innovative therapies, I think is quite unique at the moment. What we also know, of course, is that there's huge opportunities, and we're hoping this is something that within this rare disease drug strategy, we can do in terms of a rare disease framework. We introduced the framework in 2015, but I will say it's only advanced in sort of bits and pieces. It's similar to many of the European frameworks, similar to what Australia has, and does provide the basis for what we ultimately hope will be the ability to make sure that these therapies come in as quickly as possible for many of these rare diseases, which have not only no other therapies, but are also severe, progressive, life-threatening diseases that if they don't get intervention, and in many cases have not been able to, are going to be able to benefit from it. I mean, the sad news, sad statement is that, we know that only about 5% of rare diseases actually have a treatment. There's more than 700 treatments that are available, but of course there's 7,000 diseases that could be classified as rare. And the challenges, as Ritu and others have talked about in terms of making these available to people, means that even in the best developed countries, only about 10% of patients who would be eligible are getting access. And around the world, probably less than 1/10 of 1% are getting access. So huge amount of resources, innovation put into developing these therapies, and guess what? Nobody's getting them. So this is one of the challenges that we have to address, and obviously we want to be able to do it. With that rare disease strategy, you've heard a lot of people talk about what are the pieces of it. We need to make sure we have early diagnosis and that we have accurate diagnosis. We got to get from, as Darius said, 5 years to getting to a diagnosis, and we can now, thanks to technology. We have newborn screening, I think, as Samuel talked about. We have now amazing opportunities to do genomic, testing, genomic sequencing, but also very sophisticated next generation sequencing, which means that you can get to not only a diagnosis more rapidly, but also much less costly. So all of these technologies are coming into place to help us. We're looking at the European model on reference centers and looking at how we can bring ours together. Luckily, Canada is a small country, already highly, highly collaborative. So I think we're in a great position to do that. So we're very excited about this as an opportunity. Also trying to do a new framework for how do we assess these therapies, not using the old standards of health technology assessment, which are primarily based on large-scale clinical trials, which do not exist for rare diseases, and in many cases then have come back with negative recommendations in terms of access to these therapies. So we've got to look at these therapies. Unique ways of doing the clinical trials are already taking place, but we have not yet come up with unique models in terms of being able to finance these therapies. And they're evolving, but we need to work also internationally because these therapies are coming in internationally. So I think this is really important. The other thing that I want to just segue to very quickly then is we've already talked about this Asia-Pacific Economic Coordination, which has come forth with a framework for rare diseases and bringing together all of the countries which are in the APEC coordination to urge for the development of rare disease policies and to work more collaboratively. The challenge, as we know, and as Ritu and Samuel have indicated, a little less so in Australia, because Australia, I think, is much more of a Western model, and the same as Canada is that many of the models that we have for dealing with rare diseases don't apply elsewhere. I mean, when we talk about the definition for rare diseases, I can tell you in Taiwan, the definition for rare diseases is whatever the government says a rare disease is. And when we talk about the rare disease, Taiwan's Rare Disease and Orphan Drug Act, it is not an orphan drug act to actually stimulate research and development for rare disease drugs. It's an act that specifically says, how do we provide services to people who have rare diseases? And the fifth iteration of it has just continued to include more rare diseases and to include more services. It is not meant to be directed towards providing incentives for rare disease drug development, the same as Europe or the US did, which comes to the point that I think is so important, and what Samuel and others have demonstrated, is that we need to look for opportunities for rare disease policies to come from within the countries, come from the local communities, to be well suited within the kinds of political health systems, cultures, and even the financial capacities, and not try to see if we can just impose, models that work and also don't work necessarily as well in the Western countries. I look greatly at what Samuel's doing. We looked at what Colombia has done in terms of developing a rare disease patient registry, which identifies rare diseases as a disadvantaged population and has introduced legislation to say if in fact there's a therapy that is in fact life-saving or essential for a rare disease patient, they can have access to it. It's not a basis in terms of cost. So I think we can look at how our countries themselves bringing forth these kinds of strategies and policies and work with them. And before I run out of time and breath, I just want to segue a little bit to Rare Diseases International. It is our global alliance. It does bring together, patient organizations, multi-stakeholder groups from across the globe. And our goal is to work with global organizations, including the WHO, the United Nations. For instance, in 2019, when the United Nations introduced a declaration supporting universal health coverage, we've worked very hard to ensure that rare diseases was identified as a specific population, because we know if countries are bringing in these policies, health system policies, we need it to be there and recognized in order to make a case for why they needed to include us in their developing health systems. And this year, for instance, we are at the United Nations with a proposal for the United Nations to pass a resolution on rare diseases. This will be hopefully passed this November. And the importance of it is recognized as rare diseases, not just as a health issue, but rare diseases impact people socially, as Samuel talked about, impacts economically, impacts not only the families, but also the countries, impacts occupationally, the ability to work, the ability to be able to be included, the impacts education, people, kids, and to take part in terms of education. Gender, most of the burden for rare diseases falls on women. So again, there's a gender issue there. There's an equity issue there, I think, which others have talked about. So by bringing forth a United Nations resolution on rare diseases, we hope to call upon all of the other United Nations agencies, including UNESCO, including, the World Bank, to actually support rare diseases and to provide the kinds of high-level policies that would allow us at the local level to actually be able to call upon governments to have their policies explicitly include rare diseases. Because what we know in terms of rare diseases is, if we're not explicitly recognized, then we'll be lost. And certainly, I think your question before was a really important one. Rare diseases has no option but to work collectively. Individually, as many have said, we're absolutely lost. We can get nothing. But collectively, we represent a tremendous population. But also, I think as Samuel and others, and certainly Darius indicated, what we can actually contribute in terms of research and what we can contribute in terms of knowledge has benefits far beyond just the rare diseases. There's so many therapies. There's so many technologies, including the sequencing of the genome, including many of the gene therapies, including even things like mRNA therapies that have started with rare diseases. So there's a huge reason for us to be able to include rare diseases, but unless we do it explicitly, whether we're talking about very local communities, we're talking about developing countries, we're talking about emerging healthcare systems, or whether very well-developed systems, it's not going to happen. And again, the reason why then for RDI really to focus on capacity building and increasing the capacity for efficacy and awareness. So I just close by thanking all of you that are here as fellows, because as Ritu says, without you and without your voice and without your being an informed voice, which is so very important about this very unique event, we're not going to be able to make the advances. Or if we do make advances, nobody's going to be able to not only know about it, but to be able to leverage and build on it. So huge thanks to you, and know that certainly from the rare disease community, anything that you want, we are really happy to provide for you, and look forward to what you're going to do with this once this training is over.
All right, well, thank you very much for that nice overview. And my producer tells me that you're actually not in Toronto today, you're in Edmonton. So I'm only 2/3 of a continent off, so I apologize for misplacing you earlier today. So if we could get all 5 of our guests back up here, I will tell all the journalists that while we've in the last 60 plus minutes, while we've been hearing from the speakers, they've been hard at work in the chat to the side of the stage, launching some joint study that they're thinking of doing. So I look forward to reading that in however 6 or 12 months, however long it takes to get things into the medical journals. So they're hard at work here. So we have 20 minutes for Q&A. I have several questions. For those of you who have questions of Samuel, he is going to have one of the breakout sessions at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, U.S. time today. So you can have another access to him there. So I just want to, we'll start with some of the questions. I'm going to address most of these questions to one person. For right now, if we could just limit it to that one person responding, and then if we have a little more time, we can kind of, bring in some, others commenting on the same questions. But I want to make sure we get through as many of these as I can right now. So this is from our fellow Anna Sauerthal from Der Standard in Austria. This is for Ritu. You mentioned limited accessibility of treatment. Could you tell us about initiatives on how to tackle that problem in rural areas?
How to tackle the problem of limited accessibility to care in rural areas? Is that the question, Chris?
Yes.
I can only share some preliminary ideas and thoughts around the work that we've been doing with DEBRA for patients with epidermolysis bullosa. One of the ways that we supported patients is through very simple home-based remedy, the WhatsApp group, through which we've been connecting patients with experts around the world, and not just patients, but also healthcare professionals in remote villages, regions of India, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Pakistan. From these countries, we connect patients and healthcare professionals with experts around the globe. We actually ask doctors to do videos and take pictures of instructions, which we then translate and send back to patients who have different languages and different needs. So there are many creative ways that organizations like ours actually find to support patients. We also try to support clinicians and researchers, young researchers in remote areas by providing them training at centers of expertise around the world, training that is funded by DEBRA International or by the regional DEBRA groups. So there are, I would say the initiative, the impetus, the support comes from patient organizations like DEBRA, and most of the care actually happens through these informal channels rather than through government initiatives or official channels.
So another question here for Ritu. This is from our fellow from India, from the publication for the news organization 52, Anchor Palawal. This is for Ritu. Many international research or collaborations on rare diseases barely have representatives from the global south, for example, South Asia. Why is that, and how does that affect the research?
Thanks, Ankur. That's actually one of the reasons that I'm here, is because clearly there is a huge gap in representation from the Asia Pacific, South Asia, Southeast Asia region. And I'm not quite sure why that's the case, but I can only say that representing rare disease communities is a luxury that I have had. It is because I live in an environment, in a country where I have, and I can afford a basic level of care. My daughter also has a rare disease, and I'm a parent and wife to people with rare diseases. So it's because I have the luxury of going beyond and finding the time, the resources, the energy to invest in rare diseases and in advocacy work that I'm able to do that. Whereas most of the parents that I know, caregivers, are really burdened by just taking care of their children. And there are more cases than not of parents who have had to quit their jobs to take care of the children. It's a full-time job requiring multiple people, not just parents. So it's really, parents have greater priorities, communities have greater priorities than advocacy, but you simply don't hear about those that do exist. I work with networks in most of the countries that I've mentioned in Southeast and South Asia, and there are pockets of researchers, clinicians, community members, parents who selflessly give. But perhaps not on international forums and international platforms, but we are doing our best to widen that representation.
Okay, so thank you very much. So let's, this question is kind of for anybody. Let's see if, let's have Gareth field this one first. How do scientists recruit trial participants for rare conditions, given that these patients are few and in some cases rare disease registries are lacking? This is from our fellow in Kenya from the Standard Group, Matilda Mbenwe.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a really key challenge. How do you scale and make more accessible research, in this case clinical trials in particular? I think there's, increasingly seeing the need for real world evidence in clinical trials. We're increasingly seeing new ways of creating different trials that can adapt, so it's called adaptive clinical trials or adaptive platforms. And I think we need to find new ways of reaching out directly to and enabling the participation of people in remote areas or geographic spread or less resourced areas. I think necessarily we're going to have to find hybrid ways where at least some aspects of those clinical trial delivery can be provided on country, at home, on location, and not necessarily in a metropolitan or centralized center. I think partnerships with primary care are going to be critical to that, and so the more that we develop partnerships and upskill primary care general practitioners to enable participants to join clinical trials, I think will be critical. And we must remember that in many parts of the world, primary care is the only care available, and so I think, again, coming back, those primary care partnerships, direct patient-facing portals and engagement, and a hybrid way of delivering trials where some aspects of those can be delivered in the remote locations and on country, I think are some of the emerging solutions.
Okay. Any of the others panelists have a kind of thought on that question on how to recruit trial participants for rare conditions?
I'll just jump in. Oh, sorry.
Sure. Go ahead, Durhan.
Just to say, from the, one of the important things that's been happening, of course, is many of these patient communities, thanks to the ability to connect through the internet, social media, are actually setting up patient registries. There's also and these are global, patient registries, and also engaged in doing natural history studies. So I think the more that we can have these international patient groups that are able to recruit and to be able to identify across the globe, and to know that there are the opportunities potentially for, I think, research and engagement, I think is great. The other thing you're seeing is some deliberate efforts to foster some of these communities. I mentioned the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is actually funding patient organizations to actually set up these international patient registries, and at the same time invite researchers who might actually have some ability to actually address their diseases. So they're very deliberate efforts. They're obviously, on a one-by-one basis, but it really has already had, I think, some amazing opportunities. But the patients themselves, have some great opportunities to find each other.
Okay. Ritu, do you have some thoughts on that also?
Yeah, Chris, I can share a little bit on inclusion of patients and rare disease patient advocates as being critical in design of clinical trials, and perhaps the single largest factor in their success. In Singapore, at DEBRA, we worked with pharmaceutical companies and healthcare providers, with doctors in Singapore, to enable 2 clinical trials to start in our local hospital here. What we found was the single most challenge was that the agencies that are outsourced with running the trials are often follow the trial design set by the pharmaceutical companies, which hobble participation of patients. For example, these trials sometimes fund for only one parent to travel with a child. In the Asia Pacific region, you can imagine, where travel is so difficult, not just for the common person, but for a parent with a child with a rare disorder, sometimes travel can be absolutely excruciating. Imagine having one parent travel with a child for a clinical trial to a distant location. It's almost impossible. But where clinical trial design actually has the inclusion of patients sharing what is absolutely necessary, like 2 parents traveling, needing to stay overnight at the site of clinical trial, then suddenly we find that participation jumps. In fact, in countries like India and Pakistan, you can recruit as many patients as you want, because of the very large populations and so many patients with rare disorders. So clinical trials in the Asia Pacific are a rarity. I can't tell you the exact figure, but I believe it's a very, very tiny fraction of the global clinical trials happening currently. And including patient organizations is perhaps going to be the game changer.
Okay, well, let's go on to another question. This is from Aaron Prater from the Colorado Springs Gazette in the U.S. This is open to all, but I'll throw this to Daria first if you want to address this one. Can you speak to the psychological burden of rare disease, specifically the isolating nature of the diagnostic odyssey?
Well, yes, of course. I think that this is something that has been recognized, but currently we still do not have enough of studies actually that can demonstrate this. And of course, psychological burden of rare diseases is not yet fully integrated in what we call the holistic healthcare. So I think in terms, of course, the isolation and even and especially in the current times where this isolation was even deepened by the fact that that patients with rare diseases could not go, for example, to the hospital, or they were worried to go to the hospital. The fact, that they were cut from the services, let's say, and help that they usually were receiving. This is something that was. That is even increasing. We are currently started actually to work with a group which is called what is called a cost action on burden of diseases. And so we are going to initiate in the coming days the first collaboration where we are going to try to work on how to actually use the best methodologies also to measure the burden of diseases from different aspects, being it psychological or economic, and to put more in light this kind of studies. And recently we also opened a funding opportunity actually also to finance what we call social sciences and humanities studies in this domain. So things are being done, but obviously, and they are being reported also by the patient organizations at different level, but I would say not sufficiently, and they are not yet fully, I would say, integrated as we would expect, also in terms of the overall evaluation of the burden of rare diseases at national or international level.
Chris, I think direct response to the question, I think there's a triple whammy with rare diseases when it comes to mental health burden. And those are factors that are inherent in rarity itself and the nature of the condition. So rarity itself creates isolation and lack of connection. Particularly if you don't have a diagnosis and you don't have a community you can connect to and share with, learn from, have a shared journey. There's also there's an element often of disbelief. People's symptoms may not be believed. They may be attributed to a primary biological disease, may be attributed to some sort of psychological disturbance when a number of times, and that again is isolating. There may be the primary components of the individual rare disease that cause mental illness. For instance, just think of something like Huntington's disease can present with psychosis as its initial presentation, with an acute disturbance, an acute mental illness. There's also the issues that Samuel raised in terms of stigmatization and the mental health burden of those, and then wrap all those up and then add them to the mental health burden of having a chronic disease. And so I think there's an enormous mental health burden, and I think we are only really appreciating the very tip of the iceberg, and I think there's so much work to be done. And one of the key things also is that often mental health strategies in many jurisdictions are silent on rare diseases as an entity. So I really think this is one of the real missing links in rare disease care and research, and something which deserves so much more attention. And it's really heartening to see the EJPRD focusing on some more of these sort of social and mental aspects.
Okay, so we have one more question. Samuel, you had thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, being a clinician in the mental health space, I felt I need to add up a piece to this. What brought me into the space is due to the mental health impact of the rare disease on the family. And so we cannot take it out. It's for me, it's rare diseases. It's a series of traumas that families have to go through at every stage of the care, from trying to find a diagnosis to trying to find treatment. It's series of traumas. To every stage you get to know, okay, this stage is it's a huge hurdle that you have to jump at every stage of the journey, and this has a huge impact in the psychological well-being, depending on the social factors available as well within the space and the setting where one comes from. And so in our setting, where it has also compounded by spiritual beliefs and other issues in the poverty, it makes it more difficult and more devastating, and even trigger it more into developing severe mental health disorders during that time.
Okay, thank you very much. And so fortunately, we're running short on time. I do have one more final question from one of our fellows. This is from our fellow from Germany, a freelancer, Jen Pinkowski. This is for anybody who'd like to respond. I think Ritu or Jain could probably handle it. How might the absence of genetic data from people with rare diseases in the global south skew the existing data? Does somebody want to tackle that one?
I mean, I think we know that there are many diseases that do have some local kinds of, whether it's based on ethnicity or whether it's based on, inheritance patterns, right? So we don't know these. I think Africa is actually a huge area in which there is a lot of unknown. Gareth talks about the indigenous populations. We have in Canada a project that's called the Silent Genomes, and that is not only our indigenous people not getting contributing their genetic information, but specifically, diseases that might be inherent in those populations are not being identified. So I think it is, in fact, a huge opportunity to miss, but recognizing again, the huge need to be able to engage, more. I think what we tend to miss are not only people that would have very, very small diseases that are not being recognized. But, what we've got now in terms of the advances in terms of genome sequencing are not to be minimized. And I think that's going to be a huge opportunity. But as I think I look at Gareth, because he's been a real leader in this, unless we go to those populations, unless we actually engage those populations, and it isn't a matter of just going in and sticking a needle in somebody's arm and says, hey, can I have your DNA? It really has. And what Africa Project has taught us is we really have to engage people holistically to have people be part of it. But the other thing that's missing in this, and many institutes have talked about it, you can't just go and take people's information. the question is, what are we giving back? What are they getting out of it? They are not research subjects. They are people who are living with conditions that really do need to be able to be part of the project. And, so I think it's behooving on all of us to think about, how do we engage people that we're missing, not just to contribute to a better understanding of the genome, but what can we do in terms of these populations that are really of the benefit to them. So it's engaging them as partners and participants. They're not subjects.
My speakers, Daria, Ritu Jain, Gareth Banum, Samuel Wiafi, and Durhain Wong Rieger. Thank you very much for taking the time, and break for right now. Thanks much.